history runs in cycles. So wherever you parachute in history, there are going to be moments where generations are at odds with each other because they think each other had it easier, right? Or one of them had it easier. And look, I'm just to be really clear, I am a capitalist and I'm not a socialist or a communist. And I don't believe in an economy or society where everybody is absolutely equal economically. It's just not realistic. We should be equal in terms of the fairness of the laws that apply to us. But in terms of our own individual states, a huge reflection of that is going to be based upon our ability to work hard and our own individual talents and stuff like that, right? I also am just a believer in the Pareto principle, which is the 80-20 distribution, right? And over time, wealth will probably concentrate more or less along a Pareto distribution where you'll have 20% that have a lot more wealth than everybody below, but that's because in general, they work harder and have had more good fortune and all that type of stuff. What you want to create is an environment where everybody basically has the same odds of making it into that top 20%, right? That you're starting from a place of fairness, that the rules are fairly applied to you, that if you want to work hard and be innovative and whatnot, that you've got an equal shot of being one of those in the top 20%. So again, I'm not trying to say we should strive to this super flat society economically, just because I don't think it's realistic. Now, that being said, over the past several decades, first off, the boomers will probably be angry at me for bringing this up, but the boomers were the me generation. They adopted a much more sort of self-centered, one might say narcissistic view than their predecessors, right? The greatest generation was all about, fighting the wars and what we can do for society. The boomers were much more, well, okay, but what's in it for me, right? So you have some of that starting off in this group, right? They also were very fortunate, and I don't blame them for this, but the boomers probably lived at the greatest acceleration of individual prosperity in human history, especially if you lived in America, right? Where we were the only man standing after World War II. We basically helped the rest of the world be built. We were the world's manufacturer. The middle class exploded because there was so much opportunity to get a good job here and raise a family, without having to work, 100+ hour weeks in sweatshops and stuff like that. So they had a really good tailwind behind them. But as they amassed wealth and then voting power, as they formed capital and then became the dominant cohort voting-wise, not sort of unsurprisingly, politicians catered more to them. As politicians became boomers, they started writing much more boomer-friendly laws and regulation. If you look at the tax code, it's a ridiculously thick document, right? And the first page says, okay, this is what you have to pay in taxes, unless you invest in these type of properties, unless you do this different sort of thing, right? And so the rules and regulations increasingly got favored to those who owned assets. And as the boomers, became the largest and wealthiest cohort, every time something was done or engineered to support asset prices, like bail out the housing market, right? The Fed stepping in, buying mortgage-backed securities, like the Fed running QE for QE 1, 2, 3, 4, in the decade after the global financial crisis where we weren't in any kind of crisis anymore. All that stuff was to goose asset prices. Well, who owns asset prices? One, the boomers, the older generations, because wealth has a strong correlation with age. And then, the wealthy. I think it's something like 93% of all financial assets are owned by the top 10% of households. So, you've just had this accretion of advantages that have been benefiting this class, and that just like the magic of compounding, that compounds over time and they leave people further and further behind. The other thing, kind of the double-edged sword of a lot of these policies that were pushed out there, QE, both monetary and fiscal, great examples of this, is they just increase the prices of everything. So if you are not one of the wealth holders, you don't get the boost in asset prices, so you don't get that benefit, but you do get the pain of an increase in your cost of living, right? So that means you're getting left further behind at a faster pace than those who have assets, right? So it's just kind of been this natural progression of people who had advantage, reinvesting that advantage to continue to further their own advantage over everybody else. And it's not just, in the citizenry. We've definitely seen the same thing in corporations, where you're pretty hard pressed these days to find an industry that has not become a corporate cartel, that is run by a small number of very big companies who have worked with DC to influence regulations such that it is kind of prohibitively challenging for a new competitor to break in and, really threaten them. And so, so who benefits from that? Well, the people that run and own those companies. Well, those tend to be the older boomer generation. So there's been this confluence of factors that have contributed over the past several decades to end up where we are. Now, of course, the really toxic side of that is you start to then, your younger generations, when they start to realize, hey, look, that brass ring that I've been sold on, hey, if I just work hard and do everything I'm supposed to do, I'm going to be able to achieve that lifestyle. They start to doubt that they have good odds of getting into that top 20%, like I mentioned earlier. And when they lose faith in that social contract, that's when really bad things start to happen, right? That's when they either start checking out. So we have literally millions and millions of able-bodied Americans, working age, who have just given up, who are literally living in their parents' basements, just saying, look, why bother? And then similarly too, you get people that say, well, look, this system's just not working for me, right? So there's sort of the class war and demographic war antagonism that you were referencing earlier, where like, hey, it's all those damn boomers' faults. Let's go get the boomers, or the eat the rich, chant that you're hearing a lot now. But also just like, hey, look, I don't think capitalism works anymore because you say we're a capitalist society, but I don't see myself ever being able to afford to buy a home, right? Or to afford to start a family, right? So what's really dangerous when people get to that stage is they start looking around at alternatives. And there are people who will try to sell them an alternative like socialist agenda. I think history economically is very clear that socialism does not end well. But if you're a younger person who is really demoralized and you've got a choice at the voting booth and you kind of feel like I'm getting screwed by the current system, you're like, okay, you're telling me that socialism doesn't work anyway, but at least that guy's going to give me some free stuff along the way. So, do I go with the guy who's going to screw me and I'm not getting anything for free? Or do I go with the guy who might screw me, but I'm going to get free stuff? I think I'm going to go with that guy. Right. And I think that's a very dangerous Pandora's box to unlock. And I think, sadly, we are pushing a lot of the younger generation towards opening that box. If rates come back down significantly, you want to be in assets that obviously can either outgrow the rate of inflation. And so stocks can be a very fine asset class to beat inflation. In fact, historically, they actually have been a pretty good asset class to beat inflation. Obviously, at the end of the day, inflation is, as Milton Friedman said, anywhere and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of owning the precious metals as an inflationary hedge, as a way to protect the purchasing power of my wealth. I actually think that they've had a great run, but I think looking over the next couple of decades, I think they still offer potential not just to shield you from purchasing power devaluation, but to actually increase your purchasing power as well. I do think there's double reasons to own them. I think the commodity complex is going to do very well. And again, when you're trying to protect against inflation, you want to invest in things that have inherent value that can't be inflated away. So, no matter how many dollars the Fed prints, productive farmland has an intrinsic value. The market's always going to pay, close to fair value for. So, I think commodities in general, but I think looking forward to the future that we have lying ahead of us, there is a lot that says that commodities could actually have a really nice run from a relative appreciation standpoint. So I think not only will you get defense against inflation, but I think you could get a lot of potential real incremental gain. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, just reversion to the mean wise, commodities relative valuation to the S&P 500 is at like decadal lows, still near decadal lows right now. And just reversion to the mean suggests that there could be a really pretty strong pickup in commodity prices or the price of the overall commodity complex. Well, and if you listen to guys like Rick Rule, Rick has said for decades now, we have underinvested in the capex of a lot of critical natural resource sectors. And so even if demand just stays flat going forward, which it won't, it'll grow, but let's just assume it stays flat, we're going to run into pretty severe supply constraints or full-blown supply shocks with a lot of really key commodities. That's going to drive the prices of those a lot higher. And then if you look at the policies that the new administration is aggressively pursuing, the drill baby drill, the mine baby mine, they're really getting rid of a lot of red tape that has prevented a lot of natural resource investing inside this country. When you look at the amount of electricity production that we need to add, we need to, by multiples, increase our electricity production over the next just couple of years to be able to compete more squarely with China. The amount of build out that is going to take, data centers, pipelines, new natural gas wells, it's going to be just epic. New nuclear plants, new forms of nuclear technology. It's hard not to see that unleashing a real bonanza for commodity demand. And again, that's not US only. I think the world is kind of waking up that, through globalization, we became way too dependent on a very small number of highly efficient supply chains. That's not what the future is. The future is having a lot more resilience as a sovereign nation. And that means that we're going to have to make a lot more infrastructure investment in a lot of these different nations. So I think commodities have a really good future ahead of them. And I think that will also be a good way to protect against inflation.